Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I have to introduce myself again for television since we've just gone live on C-SPAN. I'm John Fogerty, Washington correspondent of the San Francisco Chronicle, and I'm president of the National Press Club. Quiet! All right, if you all be quiet, you'll be able to hear me. That's the Chuck Manette approach to quieting down an audience. It's one of the few things Chuck did this year that worked. Again, I'm John Fogerty. I'm president of the club. I'd like to welcome you all, be here tonight to our newly renovated facility. It's really just amazing what you can do if you work really hard on nights and weekends. Now, my term expires January 18th. That's 43 days, 18 hours, and 28 minutes from now. Now, I can't say that I've enjoyed every minute of this term, but I really have enjoyed most of it. I can't think of any other post that you get in this town or anyplace else where you can meet the president, cabinet officers, kings, queens, prime ministers, ambassadors, the movers and shakers in politics and business, radicals, dissidents, and Dear Abby all in one year. It's a unique institution, a unique position. I feel very happy to have had the opportunity to be the 77th president of the club, and this dinner is one of those reasons. It's really a very special moment for a president of the press club. Once again, tonight, history's being made in the press club ballroom. This room's played host to presidents, prime ministers, potentates for half a century. It was only about a decade ago that the club thought to honor the distinguished professionals among us, those who have made us proud to be journalists. Tonight's honoree, Helen Thomas, is the 1984 winner of the club's most coveted prize, the Fourth Estate Award. Ladies and gentlemen, let me do what you all have already started to do, a toast to Helen Thomas. They say that people make the party, and it's pretty clear that the audience is going to roll this one. Could I put this down there? Thank you. Helen is the first woman and the first wire service reporter to win the award. And let me say to you that, as I said to the awards committee when we met one time, that the prize was overdue in both categories. Now, past recipients of this award are listed in your program, and I will not read all the names. You can read them for yourselves. But we do have three here tonight with us, and I would now like to introduce them and ask them to stand. Herbert Block of the Washington Post. Richard Strout of the Christian Science Monitor, and of course TRB. And Simeon Booker, Washington Bureau Chief of Johnson Publications. And Simeon's here somewhere. Now, as you are all aware, we have an overflow crowd. I apologize that it took a little longer to serve you all dinner than it would have if we'd held the crowd down, but we wanted to accommodate all of Helen's friends, colleagues, and as a matter of fact, we eliminated the head table so we could squeeze in 4 more tables. Now, you're going to be hearing from a number of friends of Helen's, and I'd like to what an entrance. Donaldson, you just killed one of my lines, and that was that Sam Donaldson was stuck in the Atlanta airport, but we all know about that. Now, you'll be hearing from some of Helen's friends and colleagues. I would like to introduce 4 people who are at our, not head table, but round table, that do not have to speak for their dinner tonight. First, I would like to introduce Mr. Morton Phillips, who is the gentleman who gives Dear Abby her advice. He's her husband. Next is Jan Donaldson, wife of an ABC News White House correspondent that you will meet later. Laura Speaks, wife of the Principal Deputy White House Press Secretary. And my wife, Jenny Fogarty. In this business, we have a term called a stopper. That's a person that holds it all together when it's all hitting the fan. Jenny is the stopper in our household. I would also like to recognize Al Cromley of the Daily Oklahoman, who has for 2 years been the chairman of the committee that chooses the 4th Estate Award winner. It's a very difficult job, and I don't know where he is, he's out here somewhere. Al Cromley. I'd like to introduce Joe Slevin, who's president of National Press Foundation, which underwrites the prize. Joe, where are you? Joe's over there. 2 other people that really put this evening together, Don Larrabee and Mary Beth Larrabee. Two other people I really want to recognize are 2 people that I've known for a long time, and over the years I've come to associate the word courage with both of them. That's Jim and Sarah Brady. Now, traditionally, we ask 3 or 4 colleagues and friends of the honoree to give an objective look at the real person we're saluting, more or less to underscore our wisdom in making this selection. First, I'm going to call on Abigail Van Buren, whose Dear Abby column is the most widely syndicated column in the world. I might add, as I learned tonight, that the San Francisco Chronicle had the good sense to be the first paper to run that column. You wonder why it's a successful newspaper. Her syndicate says that there's an estimated 80 million people read her advice in some 1,000 newspapers every day. Abby must have some important advice for Helen because she came all the way from the West Coast to be with us, and we welcome her to the podium now.
Well, Dave Deere came over to my table tonight, and he said, Abby, I called your syndicate and told them that Helen Thomas was going to be given the 4th Estate Award, and she'd like to have Dear Abby come, say a few words. No money, no expenses. She can only talk for 3 minutes. They said, you'll never get her. Well, they called, gave me the facts, and I said, for Helen Thomas, I'll pay to go. Well, what can you say about Helen Thomas? I've known Helen for a long, long time. She has covered 5 presidents, and I can tell you, she's never met a president she really liked. Helen's a real professional. She never takes anything for granted. She checks out all the facts. You might say that she is the original doubting Thomas. Terrible, terrible. Now, Helen's colleagues agree that regardless of her personal feelings, and she has them, her reporting is always objective, fair, and without a trace of bias. But those who know her well know where she stands politically. Last year, at a crowded gridiron cocktail party, someone asked me if I'd seen Helen's pal, Fran Lewin. And I said, well, she's right over there, just left of Helen Thomas. Stranger behind me said, nobody is left of Helen Thomas. Now, this has not been verified, but Helen was credited with the following. I have good news and bad news. First, the good news. A busload of anti-ERA people just went over a cliff. Now the bad news. 3 seats were empty. Sorry, Helen. True. Helen is revered by her colleagues. I was told that when Joe Layton was the deputy press secretary, thank you, Mrs. Layton. Joe said that his bedside telephone rang at 4 o'clock in the morning. Well, he answered it, and somebody from UPI asked a kind of a dumb routine question. And Joe snapped, for Christ's sakes, Helen Thomas could have answered that. The person on the other end said, yeah, I know, but we wouldn't dare to disturb Miss Thomas at this hour. Now, here's some facts about Helen. She is scrupulously honest. She has never been known to betray a confidence. She loves to laugh, and she enjoys a good cry. She loves to cook, but she hates housework. She loves to eat, but she hates to exercise. She is fiercely loyal to her friends. She's proud of her heritage. She's a honey. Helen is a champion for women's rights, civil rights, human rights. She hates poverty, bigotry, deceit, and injustice. Now, I promised Helen that I would read her favorite Dear Abby letter, and I will. It reads, Dear Abby, 2 women just moved across the hall for me. One is a middle-aged gym teacher, and the other is a social worker in her late 20s. These 2 ladies go everywhere together, and I've never seen a man go into their apartment or come out. Do you think they could be Lebanese? Well, I'm not Lebanese. God knows I'm no lesbian. But I want to tell you, I just love Helen Thomas.
Larry, I don't envy you. I'm glad I get to open and close this program and stay out of the way in the middle. We've been waiting. Don Larrabee says he's been waiting for years for someone in broadcasting, maybe Sam, to say, "Larry Spokes, the White House speaksman." And I would now like to bring up Larry.
Well, a roast of Helen Thomas. I have been waiting 4 long years for this moment. But I can't be too tough. I'm the only one in this crowd that's got to face her tomorrow across the briefing room. They told me to say something funny about Helen Thomas. For a guy that faces her every day, there ain't nothing funny about Helen Thomas. But a bit from backstairs at the White House. You know, they say Helen Thomas is getting soft on the president. She's becoming a patsy in the White House. Well, I'm here tonight to defend Helen Thomas and say it just isn't so. You know, she's the only reporter that writes what the president meant to say before he says it. Let's look at some recent Helen Thomas stories. Dateline, Geneva, by Helen Thomas, United Press International White House reporter. Diplomatic sources today said President Reagan will hold a summit meeting with his son Michael. The White House denied it. Our statement was, our position remains the same. We must have a well-developed agenda and a reasonable chance for success. Helen wrote that. I'm just reading it. Another zinger on the president's foreign policy. Dateline, Moscow. Highly placed diplomatic sources revealed a letter President Reagan wrote to Soviet leader Chernenko. Quote, "You and I have much in common," the president wrote. "I can sympathize with your problems. You have troops bogged down in Afghanistan, unruly priests preaching freedom in Poland, and a lousy wheat crop in the Ukraine. And," the president wrote, "I've got Helen Thomas asking me questions at my press conferences." Did he really say that? And she writes about the budget, and does she write about the budget? Dateline, Washington. The White House today revealed a major budget-cutting decision. The new Reagan budget will distribute the burden of the deficit reduction equally on the rich and the poor alike. Both are entitled to the same amount of ice. Only the poor will get theirs in the winter. That's the only difference. Another budget decision. Helen writes, this one on new federalism, which is a joke in itself. The federal government will now provide the cheese, but the states have to buy their own crackers. And you ain't seen nothing yet. White House aides today came up with a plan to do away with the federal deficit once and for all. They said, put it in a suitcase, check it on a Piedmont flight to Newark. That way you'll never see it again. One more 2-hour budget meeting, and I'm going to recommend that one. Dateline, the Cabinet Room. Reagan budget cutters were at it again today, trying to hammer out an agreement on defense spending. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger was described by one participant as his own worst enemy. David Stockman stood up and said, "Not as long as I'm alive." I believe that one. And then after the president named his cabinet and sent them to the Senate for confirmation, Helen wrote, every one of the president's nominees was subjected to ideological sniping, vicious innuendo, anonymous slurs, and general character assassination. And that's just from the White House staff. Helen, is it true that you have a key on your typewriter that says Larry Speake said what the president meant to say was? But to set the foolishness aside and some serious words about Helen Thomas, she's been honored for many things. First woman close to close a presidential news conference with a traditional "Thank you, Mr. President." First woman officer of the National Press Club. First woman officer of the White House Correspondents Association. First woman member of the Gridiron Club. And tonight she becomes the first woman to receive the National Press Club's Fourth Estate Award. But she's being honored tonight not because she's a woman, although that's important. She's being honored because she's a pro, a true professional in every sense of the word. A story comes to mind that really tells what this reporter is all about, that we know so well, and who knows her beat better than anybody has ever known it. It takes place on a quiet Washington Sunday morning, not long after President Ford took office in 1974. At 9 a.m. on that morning, calls went out all over Washington. Come to the White House immediately. The President will make an important announcement. Well, the newsmen we call raise questions. What is this? Is it foreign? Is it domestic? What is it? Well, the White House wasn't talking. Big secret. The mystery prevailed as a pool of reporters gathered to go in the Oval Office. President Ford was in the wings awaiting his cue to come before the cameras. And Helen spoke and scooped the world. She said, "I've got it. He's going to pardon Richard Nixon." And she was right. Call it intuition, call it luck, call it what you may, but I call it professionalism. Helen, your illustrious predecessor, Helen's illustrious predecessor at the White House, the late Merriman Smith, once said in a moment of frustration, "Where have all the giants gone?" Little did he realize he himself had become a giant in this business we call news. Helen, you too are a giant, respected, revered, yes, and loved. I've got a letter that only comes on this green stationery from one person. Dear Helen, I'm delighted to join your colleagues and many friends in congratulating you on being chosen to receive the National Press Club's Fourth Estate Award. This award is a well-deserved tribute to your professionalism as a journalist. You have a worldwide reputation for being the best, always first, always accurate, always fair. Millions of citizens are enlightened through your work, and you're an inspiration to all who seek to be good reporters. Hardly a day goes by when I don't ask the staff, what is Helen writing? For your experience and wisdom have become a barometer on the issues of the day. You're not only a fine and respected professional, you have become an important part of the American presidency. I am proud to salute you tonight. Sincerely, Ronald Reagan. Let me say one more thing to Helen. And Helen, you said it 1,000 times. Thank you, Mr. President. Well, tonight, let me say it for all your colleagues, all your friends, all your readers. Thank you, Helen Thomas. Hey.
While most of us tonight had to make it through the elements from McLean or Bethesda or someplace like that, our next speaker had to fight his way back from San Antonio through the Atlanta airport, and we really had almost given up on him, but fortunately everything worked and he got here. We're also very fortunate to have him because he's known as a rather shy, retiring individual who normally shies away from the public spotlight. And so we feel very pleased at the National Press Club that he has agreed to speak tonight. welcome Sam Donaldson.
Helen, I do bring you greetings from Frank Borman and the Greater Atlanta Airport. It was tough. But I was coming back from San Antonio, where today I had been denouncing Ronald Reagan's press conference policies. What press conference policies? Before a group of news directors. And Jim and Larry, Helen would have wanted it that way. I want to say a few words. Have I known Helen Thomas? Have I known Helen Thomas? There was that windy day on the South Lawn many years ago. Reporters were then allowed on the South Lawn without handcuffs on. They planted a tree, a cedar of Lebanon, on the South Lawn. The president was there, the ambassador from Lebanon, many dignitaries, and when they were left, we reporters remained behind. In those days, we were allowed to remain behind on the South Lawn. And we said to Helen, here's the shovel. Shovel in a little dirt. And she at first didn't want to do it, and finally we prevailed on her, and as she did it, I felt the ghosts of presidents past, present, and future saying, shove her in. Shove her in. But we did not. And I think the reason presidents feel that way, one of the reasons is the questions she asks them. Helen, do you recognize this question? Mr. President, now that your policy in Lebanon has failed, and the blood of 261 Marines is on your hands, and you have battleships there for no good purpose, and you're allowing the marauding Israelis to occupy the country, my question is this, sir. What's going on here? And I have two follow-ups. Substitute Vietnam for Lyndon Johnson, substitute Watergate for Richard Nixon. The question is always the same, and it drives them nuts. As well it should. Now, but her questions are not always long. One time I remember that Ronald Reagan came to the press room flanked by senators from both parties. He had been hammering out, he said in his office, a compromise on the MX. And he said, I'm pleased to tell you that we have today hammered out a compromise to save the MX. And I want to compliment both the Democrats and the Republicans for putting the country's interests first, and for thinking of this great land of ours, and for saving the MX by agreeing to this compromise. Of course, it fell to Helen to ask the right question. Mr. President, she said, what is the compromise? Well, what is the compromise? What is the compromise? John Tower, won't you tell him what the compromise? And poor old John got up and he told him the compromise. You remember that day? The president retired, and I gave him full credit for hammering out that compromise. Never mind, he had not the foggiest idea what it was. That is the test of leadership, I'll agree. But we have to have Helen Thomas. Helen is always working. And she taught me a valuable lesson early on when I first came to the White House. She is always working, and that is what a reporter should do. One late afternoon, I wandered into the lower press office. The door was shut, which was unusual for those days. Today, of course, the door is always shut. And I discovered there was a little party going on for a fellow named Rex Granum. It was his birthday, and he occupied the corner office in the lower press office, and they had a little champagne and cake, and they didn't really want me there, but since I'd wandered in, they said, come on and have a little champagne, so I did. And in a few minutes, they shut the door. A few minutes later, Ed Bradley, who was then at the White House, wandered in. Same thing happened, come on in and have a little glass of champagne, Ed, and he did. They shut the door, and here came Jimmy Carter. Now it was clear why they had the door shut. Now, they had the door to the press room shut, not to the upper. Well, anyway, he came down, and he sipped a little champagne, and Ed and I, who had covered his campaign, began to just reminisce with him. But you remember that night in Milwaukee, Mr. President? It was raining, you know, and you said that silly thing and all that. And he was responding. We were sipping champagne, and pretty soon the door opened, and there was Helen. She had discovered the party. She came right in. She said, hello, Mr. President, now about your energy program. What I want to know is... Well, he ran away, of course. But I learned a valuable lesson that day. And the lesson is this. If you're ever having a little polite chat with the president, you see Helen Thomas coming, shut the door and lock it. No, the lesson is that Helen taught me, as she's taught so many reporters before me and reporters after me, that the purpose of being in the White House is try to find out what's going on there, which is a combination of what they say is going on there, what the critics contend is going on there, but over and above that, her own judgment, built on years of experience about what's going on there. That brings to Helen's reporting something the rest of us lack. And Helen, I've got to say to you tonight, I've learned most of what I know there from you. You have to take the blame for that. But I'm going to move on. Presidents come and presidents go, and reporters like me come and we go. But Helen Thomas, we need you to stay forever. And I hope you do. Thank you.
I think that was a wonderful speech for Helen, Sam, and I think now that probably Peter Jennings is wondering, where are you going to go? That's Peter's problem. Our final speaker tonight is Grant Dillman, who has perhaps worked with Helen longer than anyone in Washington. As the Washington manager of United Press International, he was her boss for many years. Now he's executive director of the National Press Foundation, which provides support for the Fourth Estate Award and other awards programs. Grant wants to tell you about the Helen Thomas he knows. Grant, welcome.
Well, this evening sort of underscores a question that I've been harboring for a long, long time. Good grief, Helen Thomas, is there no escaping you? This morning you were in my bedroom talking about presidential children on Good Morning America. On the subway, I found you plastered all over the Washington Times. And then I sneak up to the press club for a quiet drink, and here you are receiving the club's Fourth Estate Award. Helen, after nearly 40 years of this kind of thing, isn't that enough? More seriously, now that we've heard all of these innuendos about Helen, let's talk a little bit about the real Helen Thomas. To use a word attributed to Ron Cohen by the Washington Times, Helen has some warts. Oh, Ron said she was unique, but he said she had some warts. Let me tell you about a couple of them. First, she ignores her bosses. I can't tell you how many times Helen has been told to cut down on those 16 and 18-hour days. But still, every morning she's there at the White House before almost everybody. Of course, there's a good side to that. Somebody has to find out what's going on until Larry speaks. Helen also has problems with economics. She once told an interviewer she loves her job so much that she would cover the White House for nothing. Unfortunately, the new owners of UPI found out about it. And they decided what was good enough for Helen was good enough for everybody. And they cut wages 25%. Helen also addresses a lot of groups, including publishers. And the trouble is she insists on telling them the truth about the Reagan administration. And we know how some publishers feel about that kind of truth. In fact, they sometimes complain to Helen's bosses, but she refuses to reform. Just a stubborn woman, I guess. Helen has another serious deficiency. She can get very angry about injustice, but she has no sense of outrage where her own welfare is concerned. At one point in her career, she was teamed up at the White House with a man who felt strongly he should be number one and who treated her accordingly. Helen never complained, even when it became obvious he was out to undercut her in every way he could. She just worked all the harder and beat him out for the job, on merit. He went on to other and lesser things. In short, though, I don't quite understand why we're honoring this woman with all these defects. All she has brought to journalism are dedication, professional skill, tireless energy, loyalty, and a fierce determination to inform the American people on what their government is doing. But if you persist in this, and judging by the response, I guess you will, John Fogerty is here to do the honors. Mr. President.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to make two presentations to Helen. First, caricature that is on your programs of Helen, which I would like to present to her. Helen, come on up. I'm running out of room. Why don't you hold on that? And second, Helen, on behalf not only of the National Press Club, the Board of Governors, and the National Press Foundation, but of all of your colleagues in this town, all of your friends all over this country and all over the world, the Fourth Estate Award. Thank you very much. You want me to hold on that for you? She's going to bring her feet.
It's a little hard to hear your obituary when you think you're still alive. Sam, we really wanted to provide the helicopter motor roar while you were speaking, couldn't manage it. Good evening, Mr. President, colleagues, friends, and relations. I am deeply honored to receive this award from the National Press Club and deeply grateful. I'm also grateful to United Press International, which has allowed me to cover a great beat of infinite variety, frustration, and fun, and to my colleagues in UPI, who have always made me look good. In the end, I guess I owe it all to presidents, past and present. I've always felt greatly privileged to cover the White House and to have that proverbial ringside seat to instant history. Irreverent as I may seem, early on, I decided that presidents were human too. I'm not sure when I reached that conclusion. Some of them were all too human with their joys, their sorrows, and their rare nobility. Presidents, of course, are a study in contrasts. Each has put his own stamp on the White House. Each wants to go down in the pages of history for greatness. But greatness calls for presidents to rise above themselves and to rise to unforeseen occasions, and sometimes they have. One man with courage is a majority, and often one hopes that a president will be that kind of person. And one thing I've learned in my years at the White House, and particularly in the era of the Watergate scandal, all roads lead to Rome. The White House gives the orders, sets the tone, and it's the president's political philosophy that prevails. In the end, it is the president who must be, above all, credible and accountable. I saw two presidents go down the drain because they had lost their credibility and they could no longer convince, persuade, or govern. Lyndon Johnson over Vietnam and Richard Nixon in the Watergate scandal. I can assure you there is no joy in the fall from grace of any president. On the other hand, there is some satisfaction in knowing that there are safeguards against the abuse of power and that no man, not even a president, is above the law. As for the press, we defend the people's right to know almost everything. For a nation ignorant and free never was and never will be a democracy. We know that information is golden. It's the sine qua non of giving people choices before they are faced with a fait accompli. It is our role to see that people are in on the takeoffs as well as the landings. From my view from the bridge, secrecy is more harmful to a free society than almost any so-called leak. All the presidents have fallen victim to the syndrome of secrecy, and they all become apoplectic over disclosures that often legitimately belong in the public domain, dealing with our fate. But then they get over it, sometimes, that is, unless they resort to lie detectors or the plumbers, viewing information as their private preserve. On the question of credibility, the press and press secretaries also must live up to the high standards that they set for presidents. Come to think of it, I think our credibility stacks up pretty well against, say, presidents. We in the press know that in the eyes of many, our role is dubious, that we are self-appointed watchdogs of democracy, anointed by none, feared by some, and guided, we hope, by one main ethical goal, to pursue the truth wherever it leads us. We reporters are tested daily for our devotion to accuracy and our profound responsibility to the American people. We, too, are subject to a public judgment. Our report card is on the front page every day, and when we fail all. The importance of a free and robust press cannot be underestimated. Clearly, no dictatorship can tolerate a free press or survive under one. As you can see, I don't waste my sympathy on presidents, particularly since I think that they enjoy one of the greatest honors that can be bestowed on anyone, and that is the trust of the American people. I'll go with Jeff Carter, the president's youngest son, who walked over to a group of reporters and cameramen in Plains, Georgia, on a Christmas day as we were watching Carter play on the front porch with his grandchildren, obviously playing for the cameras. Don't you feel sorry for your father, the burdens, the press always watching, Jeff was asked, and he said no, he asked for it. And I'll go with Justice Brandeis, who said that a constant spotlight on public officials lessens the possibility of corruption. Every president has had his troubles with the press, dating back to George Washington. In our press room at the White House, there's a photograph of FDR with the inscription to reporters from their devoted victim. And Truman said, "When the press stops abusing me, I'll know I'm in the wrong pew." Kennedy said, "I'm reading more and enjoying it less." What LBJ said is unprintable. And Carter always seemed to be saying, "Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they do." As for Reagan, well, it's like those silent movies. He thinks that we should be seen and not heard. And when the Sandinistas fired on press helicopters near the Honduran border a few months ago, Reagan said, "There's some good in everyone." I think that Amy Carter kind of summed up the attitude toward the media when her mother escorted her to school on the first day of class after the Carters had moved into the White House, and they wanted to show that Amy was going to an integrated school, public school. The press had been alerted that they could record this great moment in history and never harass Amy again. Walking down the path to the school door, holding her mother's hand, Amy looked at the reporters and cameramen flanking the walk and said, "Mom, do we still have to be nice to them?" I have many memories covering the White House. There have been times to laugh, times to cry, times to wonder. I remember when we covered John F. Kennedy during the transition days in 1960 at Georgetown Hospital after his son John was born. And we asked him if he would like his son to grow up to be president. And he said, "I just want him to be healthy." And I remember riding on Air Force One when Kennedy came back, and we teasingly asked him what would happen if the aircraft crashed. "I know one thing," he said, "your name will be just a footnote." And I remember Jackie coming aboard Air Force One day with her German Shepherd, new German Shepherd named Clipper that had been given to her by her father-in-law, Joe Kennedy. And we sent her a note. Fran will remember this. Question, "What do you feed Clipper?" And she wrote back, "Answer A, reporters." And when we asked Kennedy how he had become a Navy hero, he said it was absolutely involuntary. They sank my boat. And I remember when Kennedy gave a dinner for the Nobel Prize winners, and lifting his glass in a toast, he said, "Never have so many intellectuals gathered under one roof since Thomas Jefferson dined alone." And I remember when scientist Linus Pauling, also a Nobel winner, picketed the White House one day with a "Ban the Bomb" sign, went back to his hotel, changed into a tux, and came back to the White House dinner. And I thought it was a shining moment in democracy. And I remember when Sarah Vaughan sang at the White House and then danced with Johnson and Hubert Humphrey. And later the black singer tearfully told us, 25 years ago, I couldn't sit down in a restaurant in this town. Or when a rabbi spoke at the Martin Luther King rally at the Lincoln Memorial, and he said that the greatest sin of all during the Nazi era was silence. And I remember the frustration of LBJ during the Vietnam War as more and more supporters broke ranks. And one day at a White House reception, Johnson beckoned Senator Frank Church over, and he was very critical of the war at the time, and he asked him, "Just where do you get your ideas?" "From Walter Lippmann," Church replied. "Well," said Johnson, "the next time you need a dam in Idaho, you just ask Walter Lippmann." At his first press conference, 2 weeks after he was in office, Johnson was asked to cite his biggest problem, and he said, being president. Once, as a guest at the LBJ Ranch with a group of reporters, when Johnson was vice president, he took us for a walk down a country road one evening to visit his cousin Oriole. And we obviously had wakened her, and when she came especially when she came padding barefoot to the door. And later I wrote that what I thought was a warm, sentimental story about a wonderful white-haired lady who lived in a ramshackle house. Cousin Oriole was furious, and she sent word back through Johnson, "Does Helen Thomas sleep with her shoes on?" And I remember when Johnson was taken to Bethesda Naval Hospital for gallbladder surgery. Psychiatric ward had been transformed into a press room. What happened to the patients? Johnson asked Bill Moyers, then his press secretary. "We gave them all press cards," said Moyers. And I remember at a dinner at the LBJ Ranch when Johnson asked Moyers, a defrocked Baptist minister, to say grace. Moyers bent his head, began to pray, and Johnson commanded, "Speak up, Bill." "I wasn't talking to you, Mr. President." Johnson used to impart a lot of wisdom to us. He used to tell us, If anyone tells you I'm just a country boy, reach in your back pocket and see if your wallet is still there. And then there were those Bataan death marches around the South Lawn in the days before women were liberated and we all wore high heels. And I remember LBJ used to complain, "Y'all have the First Amendment," as if it was some weapon invented against presidents. And come to think of it, it is. And one day on the 10th round, Johnson said plaintively that when we're talking about the war, he said, "I've got all this power and I haven't used half of it yet." And that's when I really wanted to run for cover. And one of his favorite stories was of a lad who took an oral exam to become a brakeman on the trains. And the boy was asked, "What would you do if you saw two trains approaching each other on the same track at 70 miles an hour?" The boy said, "Well, I'd go home and get my little brother." "Well, why would you do that?" he was asked. "Because my little brother has never seen a train wreck before." And I remember Midge Costanza, who said, "I don't mind Carter being born again, but did he have to come back as himself?" And I remember asking Billy Carter if he had been born again, and he said, "Once is enough." And I remember Miss Lillian, the president's mother, who said, "Sometimes when I look at my children, I wish I'd remained a virgin." I recall interviewing Miss Lillian in Plains in 1976, and she was still seething over a French woman correspondent who had interviewed her a few days earlier, kept asking her about Carter's promise, never to lie. "Do you lie?" she asked Miss Lillian. "Well," Miss Lillian acknowledged, I might tell a little white lie." "Well, what do you mean by a little white lie?" she was asked. And finally, in exasperation, Miss Lillian said, "Do you remember when you came through that door and I told you how beautiful you looked? Well, that's a little white lie." And I remember Martha Mitchell, who said, "Politics is a dirty business." And who can forget the president in those dire moments in the hospital in 1981 and looking at the bevy of nurses and doctors hovering over him, said, "If I had gotten this much attention in Hollywood, I never would have left." And in the world of interesting people, there was Henry Kissinger, man with a mammoth ego. A woman ran up to Kissinger and said, "Oh, Dr. Kissinger, thank you for saving the world." He said, "You're welcome." And once when Kissinger teased his Secret Service agents that he might be kidnapped, they told him, "Don't worry, we'll never let them take you alive." We in the press know that we are not loved, that we don't win popularity contests, and that the pendulum swings with the times and with the story. To be understood may be asking too much of a public that wants to kill the messenger who brings the bad news. But it behooves us to let the chips fall where they may, and above all, to be fair. Engraved in the mantel in the state dining room at the White House, below a magnificent portrait of Lincoln, is a prayer by John Adams, which says, "May only good and wise men live here." And surely we all hope for that. And Lincoln said, "Let the people know the facts, and the country will be safe." I believe that, and I believe that we should keep an eye on presidents who have life and death power over all humanity today to keep the people informed and democracy alive. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Helen, I hope that you will give us the chance to get your text I would like to arrange somewhere to have it reprinted, not for what advice you gave for presidents so much as for the advice you gave to reporters. I don't think that any of us in this room intend to be president, but what you said about what we need to do needs to be reviewed over and over again by us. Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Let's see.
That was very,
Very nice.
nice to meet you.
Please take this picture with you.
You want to tell them that? Or are they going to see it?
I got a big sign.
Yeah. This is my wife's Annie. Nancy covers the spring work for UPI.